Hey everybody, this is Bruce and the dog on the floor from Groxial Learning. And today we're going to be talking about authentication. In particular, we're going to be talking about a framework called phx.gen.auth. And this is from the new company called Dashbit, which is the company that employs Jose Valem, the creator of Elixir. Before Elixir, Jose actually worked in the Ruby on Rails community, and he actually applied his knowledge of authentication systems to a system called Device, and that was the primary authentication system for that framework. And it's important to have a lot of experience when you're building such a system because there are many holes that nefarious actors could exploit. So we're going to talk about phx.gen.auth. If you like what you see, there's a lot more where that came from at grox.io. This LiveView module is going to be our most extensive language module to date. We're going to have as many as 20 videos. There's actually a downloadable book, and there are going to be projects that you can work from end to end. In addition, there's a series of curated links that could basically help you understand what's happening with LiveView. So we'll hope that you'll join us. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how requests are managed within the Phoenix framework, and then we can develop a plan for how this authentication engine is going to work. So when any request comes into Phoenix, it comes in through an endpoint, then flows through the router, and then eventually flows into the application. Now, this is basically a detailed look and a coarse-grained look because each one of these main functions, they basically start by taking a thing called a plug connection that describes a request, and then they slowly add to this thing called a plug, which is going to add individual tiny bits of policy to the connection, and basically will eventually tell the browser what to do when we return that connection to whatever web engine that we have connected to it, like Cowboy or something like that. So basically, you can think about a plug as a function. The plug takes a connection and it returns a connection. And that connection adds something important to the bucket, right? So all that function does is add a tiny bit of information to the bucket or transform that connection in some way. So if you look at it in this way, well, the endpoint is full of plugs and the router is full of plugs. So what we have in the endpoint, these are individual plugs. So if you see the third one there, that fetches the session based on whatever options you have set. The fourth one engages the router, where we actually go from general policy to policy about individual requests. So and then in the router, what happens is we have individual pipelines of plugs describing our policy. So this is taken from a pipeline called browser, which is what happens when we make a browser request. So the first one says that we accept HTML, we fetch the session, but these things are actually working on the big bucket, right? So when we accept HTML, we add a tiny tag to the connection, to our bucket. When we fetch the session, we go grab the session, which is a map. When we fetch the live flash, this is a LiveView application, so we add some kind of a message to the bucket and we make that available in the connection. And then we can add a layout and so on. Okay, so our plan is that, well, you notice that there's this thing called fetch session. So one of the things that we have to do is we have to add some type of a token that we can use to look up a user, something that's safe from a security standpoint, and we need to add that to the session. And then we need to add a plug to the bottom of this browser policy, something that looks up the user. And then we're going to have a couple of conditional plugs. And what I mean by that is if there's a user in the session, we're going to redirect to the login page if they're not logged in or not logged in based on the condition of the user. And then we'll have a similar plug to redirect users away from pages where you can't be logged in case they're already logged in. So that's the way that this particular framework is going to work. Before we get too far, I'd like to talk a little bit about what this is not. So phx.gen.auth is not a full service authentication engine. Rather, it includes the tricky parts, the parts that are likely to mess us up as a community in terms of security. So this has all of the pieces that have the interplay between the plugs and the session, all the things that are tricky and easy to get wrong and easy to expose Phoenix applications to vulnerabilities. So this is not a solution that you're going to use if you want to do the single click login. It doesn't have integration with all the various email servers, but it does have integration points for all of these things. Second, this is not a macro system. So this is not going to be a type of service that you'll use where you basically turn it on and it works. Rather, this is a system that you'll use to generate code in a way that's customizable so that you could extend and adapt the authentication system to your uses, because every authentication system is different. What we really need is a head start, and this is a great attempt at that. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is generate a LiveView application. Mix phx.new. And I'm going to create an application called auth just to create a demo. And this is going to be a LiveView application because one of the things we want to do is show how to actually integrate the logged in user into the socket for your LiveView. So I'm going to go ahead and install the dependencies. And while this is running, we should talk about the way that this works. So essentially what's going to happen is this is going to generate a couple of plugs. And a plug is the composition system that Phoenix uses for web requests and responses. So this is not the Phoenix channels flow or the Phoenix LiveView flow. This is the flow for actual requests and responses. But that works okay for us because the routes for LiveView and the routes for a particular channels application basically all begin with a standard request. So what's going to happen is this system is going to generate a plug that's going to allow us to check to see if a user is logged in. If that user is not logged in, then that plug, which is just a function, will change the connection to basically redirect to the login page. And so let's change to the auth directory. So first I need to mix ecto.create, and I need to start my server with mix phoenix.server. Okay, so you can't tell, but this initial page is actually a LiveView page. We'll actually be able to see that in the route. But what we're actually going to do is add just a tiny header that basically consumes a user and says I'm logged in as whatever email address that I am, just to basically prove that we could integrate the contents of our login with the page. And that's going to be our entire application. We're going to spend most of the time looking at how the plugs work and looking at the various services that are supplied. All right, while we're in the browser, let's take a quick look at, let's look for a mix, or actually the phx.gen.auth. And let's say that this is for Phoenix. See if that's enough to get us there, and it is. So this is the GitHub project. What we really want though is the hex docs. We're looking for the version. So this is the version of the module that we want to install, of the dependency. So let's go back to our application. So we'll take a look at this and see what's happening. So this is our empty application, and I'd like to look a little bit at what it's doing. So if we open up the router, which is in the auth web with all the other web goodies, you actually see that this is a pipeline of plugs. And think about this as functions that are just piped together with one small difference. These can be halted. And when they're halted, execution of all the subsequent functions in this list basically halts. We don't call anymore. So what's going to happen is we're going to basically tack an additional plug onto this one for the purposes of one of our scope blocks. So you might see something like a bracket browser, comma, and then another plug. And basically what it will do is implement this policy, because a pipeline, just like an individual plug, is a policy. This policy is for the things that happen to an individual connection when somebody makes a browser request. And so basically, to make an authenticated request, we're going to have some type of a plug that we tack right onto these. And each one of these take the same data structure, a plug connection, and they return the same data structure. And they transform it in some small ways. So this policy means that we accept HTML, we fetch the session, and then do all these things. So what we're going to do is eventually we're going to tack on a plug here that says, hey, if there's a token, if there's information about authentication in the session, go ahead and fetch that and plug it into the connection in a way that we have access to it. So that's what to look for here. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to go to the mix.exs and we're going to add a dependency. The dependency is going to add the generator. And keep in mind, phx.gen.auth, that this is not this has not received version 1.0 yet. So basically, this is subject to change. In fact, this is probably subject to inclusion in Phoenix, but I'm not sure yet. So let's go ahead and take this. We've saved the file. Now we can fetch the dependencies. Mix.deps.get. Okay, so we fetched this new dependency, and that probably means that we can add mix phx.gen.auth, right? So this means generate the code for an authentication system. And again, all this is doing is creating the skeleton, but it wants you to be able to name things the way that you want to. So there are a couple of arguments that are required. And so if you can't remember exactly what they are, just let it fly without arguments. And then this will give you a suggestion. This is the context, which is the overall API. This is the name of the schema, and this is the lowercase name of the schema that is used in places in the API when it generates the code. So we're going to go ahead and choose those defaults. We're going to let this fly, and it's going to generate a bunch of code, and it's going to inject some code in other places. Like here you see some code is injected into the router. And so let's go ahead and get our dependencies and run the migration, and then we can look at some of the code that was generated. So I'm going to do a mix.deps.get, and so it's going to get, you can see some encryption, and this helps manage the authentication session, and this is probably required by one of those dependencies. So let's go ahead and run our migration. And we ought to expect to see some type of a table where we're managing a user and some type of a table where we're managing a token, because what's going to happen is that Phoenix is going to add basically an authentication token for every new session that's created. Okay, so we're compiling our new dependencies, and now we're creating the migration, right? And so the first thing that it does is if it doesn't exist, it has case insensitive text. So this is basically a Postgres feature, and it's creating the table users as we expected, and the indexes for that. It's creating the table for the session, users tokens, and the indexes for that. So that's beautiful. That's exactly what we wanted it to do. And so now I have working code with my generator, and we'll take a look at that next. All right, so now we get to take a look at our code. And so you can see that we have added a context, right? So these are the schemas that are inside, right? We have the user, we have the user token, and there's also this notifier API. Now, if we poke inside this notifier, you might expect to have email implementations, but this generator doesn't know which email system that you use. So it basically is just going to call this basic deliver function, which essentially does nothing but log it and return an OK, and it returns the to and the body based on the message, basically so that you could test how this system works until you have your own system plugged in. And then it has a couple of pieces of schema. So the users, as you might expect, has email and password. And remember that the password, in this case, is virtual. We don't want to store those in the database. We basically want to use the industry standard, which is bcrypt, to encrypt that. And then so we actually store the hashed password as a string into the database. And our change set handles that implementation, right? So what's going to happen is it's going to create everything that you need to specify confirmed users. But we're actually not going to require the users to be confirmed. You're going to have to do that yourself. But when you do, basically all you need to do is track this confirmed at field, right? If the user is confirmed, then you are good to go and you're safe to let the user in. If the user is not confirmed, you don't need to let the user in. And confirmation, or some type of confirmation that you're actually dealing with a human, is very important. Basically, it's part of being a good citizen as a developer. If you build a system where you don't accept some type of a CAPTCHA or some type of a confirmation, where you don't verify that there's a real user on the other side, what happens is that a spammer could actually take your site and could actually generate a bunch of email messages by signing up at a bunch of different places and actually chase users off of their valid email address. And so it's up to us as developers to be good citizens to have some type of end user confirmation. Okay, so this is the user, and you can see that most of the code in here is involved in building the chain set. So again, this is the policy. A chain set is a policy related to the inbound data as you create a new user. And then let's look at the last piece. There's a user token. And you can see that this has basically the token itself. This has some type of a context, which basically we're going to create a user per session. So some of that data is probably what goes in here. And then, so basically, this is data that we use to manage it. This is the ecto relationship with this is the ecto relationship. And we're going to create a inserted at timestamp, but you see updated at is false. So this particular model does not have an updated at timestamp. Okay, and so all we have is a build. And this is going to allow us to build a token that actually has a user ID present. And then there's a function to verify and so on and so forth, right? And so what we're really after is this context. This is the API that we're going to use to exercise the functions, right? And so there are various ways to fetch a user. You can see that we could get a user by email or email and password. We're going to use this within the authentication. But there's also a couple of things that we should look into. So one of them is, let's go ahead and work on down and look at these. Okay, this actually generates a token when a user gets logged in, right? So this is actually the code that creates the database piece. And then the other piece of logging in is actually to store that in the session. Why is that implementation not here? Well, because this is not web-oriented policy and web-oriented implementation that we're building. And so this is most of what we need on the back-end service. Now, there's another chunk of functionality that we've generated, and that actually comes in this file right here. We'll actually look at the router for a little bit. Yes, user auth right here. So this is actually the implementation of the individual plugs and everything that's web related. That this is basically our API for our controller. So it has our plugs so that we could use that with the router. It also has the implementation of the features that log a user in. So we ought to expect to see, yes, things like log a user in, write the remember me token if it exists. We can renew the session, which is really important to prevent something called a session fixation attack. We can log out the user and so on and so forth. But you can see that this is one of the plugs. And really the definition of a plug is a something that accepts a plug connection and returns a plug connection, right? So halt, you don't know, but this is actually something that returns a plug connection as well. So this is a plug, and this is a plug. And you can see that if there is a current user actually in the session, it's going to say this user is authenticated. Otherwise, it'll put a flash message, it'll store the return to, it'll redirect back. And so this basically, if the user is on a page that we want to remember to come back to after the user is logged in, we'll store that. If not, it won't. And then this redirects us to the route that actually creates a new login page. So these are the two plugs that we want to see. And this is actually our first touch point. So if we go to the router, we ought to see a chunk of authentications. Yes. So basically, we've extended our browser policy to actually also tack on this require authenticated user. So this together makes a beautifully scannable policy because these things are so well named, right? So now we can see that you can't get to user settings without being authenticated, and so on and so forth. So, and these are basically the various views that must have a non-authenticated user. So if you're not authenticated, you can't go to these basic places. So the other thing that's changed in the router is that we're actually fetching the current user right here. So all that we need to do to actually change this to being authenticated is we need to move this out of this scope, which we don't need anymore, and into the scope that requires an authenticated user, right? So, so now this is set. And have we not run migrations? Okay, so now we're getting, I must be logged in to access this page. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is take a look at some of the other services that basically will look at how a user is logged in. We'll look at how to confirm a user if you decide to do that, and we'll actually tweak the page that's in the page controller to actually consume some of the data that's in the LiveView. And I think that is going to wrap up our particular walkthrough of plug.gen.auth. Okay, so what's happened is we have gone through our plug and we have been redirected to this login page. So now we can go ahead and register. I can create a new user and then password. So I'm typing a password. Super secret is just password twice. Okay, so now this has been created successfully and I can access this page. Okay, so let's dig in a little bit to see what's happening. You can see that we are accessing the user. This is going to be in the menu service. And we also want to walk through exactly what's happening in the router as well. Okay. So this is the application. This is the router. And we're actually sending all of our plugs. Remember, a plug is just a connection. And a plug connection is essentially just a Phoenix struct. Let's look at what that looks like. So we're going to auth. Okay, so all right, so we're in here and we want to go plug.con, right? And so this is a class, and let's get help on this. And so this basically is the help for plug.con. This is basically the data that gets passed through the functions that are composed to make up a Phoenix application. At least most of a Phoenix application, those that deal directly with top-level web connections. So if I request a page in a browser, if I send a HTTP request, this is going to every connection is going to start with a plug connection. So this is a struct, so I ought to be able to plug plug.con and build an empty one of these. And you can see that these are the different types of things that are related to making a web request and response. You see the query parameters, the query string here. You can see some private data where we keep things like the session and things like that. You can see the path params and on and on and on. All of these things are related to having an individual web request. And we have some custom data, and that custom data is placed in the assigns block. So what do I mean by custom data? These are basically things that our application can use. And so in our plug, we're actually eventually going to put the current user in here, and that's how we're going to know it's authenticated. So let's take a look at where that happens. So we ought to be able to go to the page that logged us in. So here's the controller, and here's the user session controller. Of course, new is the code that actually renders the template that shows the user ID or the email and password fields. Let's take a look at what that template looks like. So we have channels, we have templates. So let's open here. And then we have the user session, and one of them should be new. And in fact, it is, right? And so this is going to take a con, and it's actually going to and it's actually going to build a form based on this, right? And so there's the email, and there's the password, and there's a remember me checkbox and the submit button. And that's exactly what we saw. So what happens when that gets submitted? Well, this is going to use the user session path. It's going to do a create. So that ought to fire. If we go to the session controller, this is going to fire create, right? Okay, so we're going to pick up the user parameters from the form, and then we're going to extract the email and the password from those. And we're going to try to grab the user by email and password. And remember, the password isn't actually going to be stored in the database. We're actually going to use encryption or bcrypt to store a hashed password. And if I find a user, I'm going to log them in. And if I don't, I'm going to render the new page again with this error message, right? And so we ought to be able to see the error message in that new template. And sure enough, there it is, right? With a type of danger. So that's either empty or it's not. And it's going to show up. It's going to show up on the page only if there's an error message. Okay, so now what we've actually done is we've actually logged the user in, and let's see what happens in the controller when that happens, right? So now we call login user. So this is where we go to the authentication code. This was one of the things that was generated by phx.gen.auth. Okay, so we're going to log in the user here. So basically, this is going to give me a token, right? So the generate user session is going to give me a token. And remember, that was this user token table, right? So this is the schema, and these are the fields that it supports. But this basically is the representation for a single user, but one of the sessions for that user, right? There's the belongs to right there. And so when we go to the user auth, and we log in this user, we take the connection, and we have a token. We have the user return to that's pulled from the session. User return to is basically the path that we remember when the user tries to log in the first time. So we basically renew the session to prevent session fixation attacks. We put the new user token in the session. We put a unique identifier called the live socket ID in there as well. This will be useful for us when it's time to uniquely identify a socket. And then we write the remember me token if we should be doing so. And then we redirect based on where we wanted the user to return to. And remember, each one of these things is effectively a plug. And a plug is just a function that takes a connection and returns a connection when it's done. That's changed in some small way, that's transformed in some small way. So this particular function returns a connection for a logged in user, right? So when we go to the session controller, what's going to happen is we're going to log in the user, and that's going to return a connection that does exactly the right thing. Otherwise, we render the new again with the error message, and we're off to the races. Okay, but so once we're logged in, what happens? Then we have to rely on the plug framework again to do the work that's important to us. So let's go look at the router one more time. So if you remember, we had plugs that were down to here. This plug is new in our routers. This fetch current user, actually, if there's a token, this is actually going to fetch a user into the session. So let's look for, okay, there's the fetch current user. So it's going to actually fetch a user and using our plug and drop it into the session. And then we ought to see another plug, and there it is, that requires the authenticated user, right? And so let's take a look at the code that implements that. So we're going to go back to this user auth. And so this is going to be another one of the plugs. So there's the fetch current user, right? And all we're doing is ensuring that there's a user token in place. And if there is, it's going to drop those into this tuple. And then we're basically going to fetch the current user using the get user by session token, which essentially is just a simple database query. And then we're going to assign the current user within the session. So if I'm using a standard Phoenix request response framework, if I have access to the plug.conf, I can use this directly. And in fact, that's what's going to happen in the layouts. Yes, so this is the user menu. And you can see we're making use of the current user within the plug connection. So once I go through this fetch current user, I'm good to go. But what happens when I need to require an authenticated user? Well, we're going to use the plug for that purpose. So let's go back to user auth and okay, so here's the require authenticated user. And remember, a plug is something that takes a connection and returns a connection. So here, if there is an assign for a current user, and remember connection.assigns, this is the map where we add custom data. If there's a current user in there that's been put there by the fetch user, I just return the con unchanged. Otherwise, I'm going to implement this policy right here, and I'm going to stop the connection. So what do? I tell the user they have to log in. I store the return to if it's proper to do so. I redirect back to the user sessions path, which is the sign in path, and then I halt the connection. So all a plug does is chain together a bunch of individual plugs, which take a plug, or they take a plug connection and they return a plug connection and pipe it straight through. That's all any Phoenix request response application does. So when we get back, let's talk a little bit about how I would take this information that I can already consume from a connection, but let's talk about how I might go about consuming this in a LiveView. Okay, so this page is a LiveView, and we're pretending that this is part of our application and not just the initial Phoenix page. We're just using it to learn. So I'm going to take this page and we're going to go to the live directory. And so the mount takes 3 arguments. This is basically the params, things like the query parameters. This is the session, so potentially what's stored in the cookies. And right now, this is where my token is established. And this is the socket. So just to make sure that we're getting what we think we are in the session, let's uncomment that and do an io.inspect of session. Okay, so let's save that. This should have reloaded. Let's see if it did. Yes, so this is our socket, right? This is the cross-site scripting token that we use to make sure that we don't have such types of attacks. This is that live socket ID that was added to the session. And this is the user token that was added to the session. So we ought to be able to extract this user token and apply it to actually fetch the information that we need, the user that we need. At this point, we know that the user is logged in because they have passed the login test. There's a current user in there. Okay, so what we're going to do is take this session and we're going to match the user token, and then we're going to use this to actually fetch a user. And now, so the design of this piece of the system, remember, this is the accounts folder, and this is the accounts, and that has basically the more or less pure functional pieces in it, the user and the token, and this also has the accounts. And so accounts, this is essentially the API that we're going to use to fetch the information. Okay, and this is the generate user session token, and this is the get user by the session token. We use this when it's time to log in the first time, right? That was the one that we basically dropped into the token. So we can use this to look up a user. We can grab this code directly, and we could drop that right into our page live. So in the mount, now we're going to have the OK, and let's just fatten this up a little bit so make ourselves some room. And then we have the query. And then I can also add the current user, and this is accounts .get user byte token, and I have the token that that I fetched up above. Okay, so that's in place now, and now I ought to be able to consume it within the view. So we could take this, and maybe all we want to do is over resources, I could put logged in as, and then we'll just drop in like that. Okay, so now all we've done is extracted this information from our page. Okay, so what do we have here? We have it's terminated, and get user by session token is undefined because I didn't alias the file. Okay, so let's go do that. So now I'll alias. So this is auth.accounts. That should do what we need it to. Okay, yeah, so it looks like it's happy. And it looks like I'm not printing my socket anymore, so this is compiled. Yes, and you see I've logged in as Bruce. So I'm consuming this data. The question you might have is, where do you go from here? Well, there are a couple of things that you can do. One is you're likely going to want to notify the users of some certain elements of this system, right? So, for example, there are a number of notifier functions that are applied with this user notifier. And so what we have here is this deliver function that is purpose-built that takes the to and a body for a particular email. And so all we're doing is logging this information in debug mode. But the intention is that you can modify this API to take whatever email arguments that you need and plug in your email service, whether it's Bamboo or something else. So these are the types of things that I might want to be able to deliver, right? So for example, if I want confirmation, then you want the user to be able to click on a confirmation link, right? And so this is the confirmation URL that's going to be passed through. And what's going to happen is this is going to actually fire one of the URLs in the confirmation, right? So this is the user confirmation controller. If I'm going to create a confirmation, this is what happens. So I'm going to deliver the confirmation instructions and I'm going to pass through the routes. And so when it's time to confirm a user, this is actually what I do. I basically allow the user to try to confirm and basically pass through the token as part of the link. If I'm successful, I put the flash, yeah, you're confirmed, redirect it to here. That's just a placeholder. You could redirect it to wherever you wanted it to go. Otherwise, you say, hey, this is a bad confirmation token for some reason, and you direct the user wherever you want them to go. So that's what I would do to implement confirmation. But obviously, you're going to have to tweak the code a little bit to only retrieve confirmed users when it's time to log in. So what we have here is really a clever little authentication system. It's not one size fits all. In fact, there is no authentication system that's one size fits all. In fact, the Phoenix team and Jose have steered away from creating a default authentication system because one size never fits all. Authentications are all roll your own solutions. So what did he do instead? He built a generator to generate the common parts that are difficult to get right, that provide a lot of pain if they fail. And that's an excellent thing. From Bruce and the dog on the floor, this is Groxio Learning.